They fired me 3 days before funding, and they were confident nothing would change. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. Ryan Blake kept it efficient. Calm voice, neutral expression. He did not raise his tone or hesitate. From his perspective, this was a simple optimization decision. "We are restructuring before the round," he said. "The system is already stable. We do not need additional overhead." He did not say my name after that. There was no transition plan, no request for documentation, no discussion about dependencies or ownership, just a clean separation. Immediate, Maya Chen was on the call. She did not interrupt. She watched, the way she always did, taking in more than she said. Her silence meant the decision had already been reviewed. Daniel Brooks did not join. He never did for decisions like this. He only looked at outcomes, numbers, forward projections. From his perspective, if the metrics were consistent, the system was functioning. That was enough. I did not respond. There was nothing to correct in that moment, because from where they were standing, everything looked finished. The dashboards were clean. Growth curves were predictable. Forecasts aligned with expectations. They were preparing for a Series A round, and the only thing that mattered was confidence, consistency, the ability to present numbers that did not require explanation. And for months, that is exactly what they had. I built the data pipeline that fed those numbers. Real-time aggregation, cross-source normalization, and forecasting logic that adjusted based on context, not just input. It was not just collecting data. It was shaping it. Most of that work did not exist in documentation. Not because it was hidden, but because it was continuous. Small corrections, timing adjustments. Edge case handling that only appeared under specific conditions. Things that do not show up when everything is working. Ryan never saw that layer. He saw output, stable output. And stable output creates a specific kind of confidence, the kind that assumes the system no longer needs intervention. That assumption made the decision easy. Cut the roll, reduce cost. Enter the funding round with a lean structure. From a distance, it was logical. From inside the system, it was incomplete. I closed my laptop after the call. No follow-up messages. No attempt to explain what was missing. Because explanation requires someone willing to understand. And they had already decided they did not need to. The office did not feel different the next morning. Same floor, same glass walls. Same rows of monitors showing dashboards that updated every few seconds. From the outside, nothing had changed. That was the point. The company operated on a single assumption. If the numbers were stable, the system was working. There was no distinction between output and understanding. Only results mattered. The funding round was scheduled in less than 72 hours. Investors were not coming in to review code or infrastructure. They were coming in to review confidence. Confidence in growth. Confidence in predictability. Confidence in the idea that what they were seeing would continue. Every chart in the main dashboard was designed for that purpose. Smooth curves, clean projections. No visible anomalies. I built those dashboards, not the interface. The logic behind them. Data came in from multiple sources. User activity, transaction records, third-party integrations, internal tracking systems. None of it was clean. None of it aligned perfectly. The system that existed on screen was not a reflection of raw data. It was a filtered version. A structured narrative built from constant adjustment. Every input passed through normalization rules. Outliers were not removed automatically. They were evaluated. Some were corrected, some were delayed. Some were allowed through only under specific conditions. Those decisions were not part of a fixed script. They were context-driven. That was the layer they removed. Ryan Blake did not see the difference. To him, the system was already optimized. The outputs had been stable for weeks. There were no alerts, no failures, no visible risk. Maya Chen walked past my desk that afternoon. She paused for a moment, not long enough to interrupt, but long enough to notice the empty space. Her expression did not change. She understood what had happened, but understanding did not change the process. Daniel Brooks sent a message to the leadership channel later that day. Focus on consistency. No surprises before investor review. That was the directive. Consistency. It sounded simple, but consistency was not something the system produced on its own. It was something that had been maintained, quietly, continuously, without being visible. The numbers on their screens still updated every few seconds, still aligned with projections, still looked exactly the way investors expected them to look. There was no reason to question anything, because from their perspective, nothing required explanation. By the second day, the system was still producing the same results. The dashboards refreshed on schedule. The projections held their shape. No visible deviation, no alerts, no escalation. From a distance, the system looked exactly the same as it had the week before. That consistency reinforced the assumption. If nothing changed, nothing needed to be questioned. The engineering channel remained active. Minor updates, routine checks, small adjustments to non-critical services. No one mentioned the data layer directly. No one asked how the numbers were being maintained, because they assumed maintenance was no longer required. That assumption came from repetition. Weeks of stable output had created a pattern. And patterns, when repeated long enough, start to look like certainty. The system was not static. It never had been. Every input stream carried variation. User behavior shifted by the hour. Third-party integrations returned inconsistent data. Time delays between systems introduced misalignment that could not be resolved automatically. Those differences did not appear on the dashboards. They were absorbed before reaching that layer. I used to monitor those variations in real time, not through alerts, but through patterns. Small changes that signaled larger shifts. When something did not align, I adjusted it before it became visible. Not to hide it, to keep the system coherent. Without that layer, the system still processed data. It still produced output, but it no longer evaluated context. That difference did not appear immediately. It rarely does. Late in the afternoon, a minor discrepancy showed up in one of the internal reports. It was small enough to ignore. A slight delay between two data sources that should have been synchronized. The kind of issue that resolves itself under normal conditions. No one flagged it. There was no reason to. The numbers on the main dashboard were still aligned. The investor view remained unchanged. Maya Chen reviewed the internal report briefly. Her eyes paused on the discrepancy for a moment longer than necessary. She did not raise it. Not because she missed it, but because it did not cross any threshold that required action. That was how the system was designed. Only visible deviations mattered. Everything else was considered noise. Ryan Blake remained focused on presentation. Slide decks, projections, narrative alignment. He did not look at the raw data. He did not need to. From his perspective, the system was delivering exactly what it was supposed to deliver. And as long as the output matched expectations, the underlying process did not matter. By the third day, the system had settled into a pattern that looked reliable. The dashboards continued to update on schedule. Growth curves remained smooth. Forecasts stayed within expected ranges. There was no visible reason to question the numbers. That was exactly what Ryan Blake needed. He spent most of that day preparing the investor presentation. Slides were refined, language adjusted, projections aligned with the narrative. Every chart told a consistent story. Stable growth, controlled risk, predictable outcomes. He did not verify how those numbers were being produced. He only needed them to be consistent. Consistency, in this context, was not accuracy. It was presentation. The difference between those two concepts rarely appears until it matters. The internal systems continued processing data at the same pace. Inputs flowed through pipelines, transformations applied automatically, outputs delivered to dashboards without interruption. From a structural standpoint, nothing had failed, but the system was no longer being interpreted. That distinction did not register immediately. A second discrepancy appeared in a separate report, slightly larger than the first, a mismatch between projected engagement and actual user activity. The difference was not large enough to trigger any alerts, but it was no longer isolated to independent inconsistencies. Still within acceptable variance, still easy to ignore. Maya Chen noticed the pattern this time. Not the numbers themselves, but the repetition. She reviewed both reports, compared timestamps, checked for obvious causes. There were none. She did not escalate it. There was no protocol for uncertainty without failure. Daniel Brooks sent another update later that afternoon. Keep everything aligned. Investors expect clarity. Clarity depended on numbers that could be explained without hesitation. At that moment, the numbers could still be explained. They still followed expected trends. They still supported the narrative being prepared. But the explanations were becoming less precise. Ryan Blake remained confident. The absence of visible issues reinforced his assumption that the system required no intervention. From his perspective, removing a role had not affected performance. If anything, it confirmed his decision. Efficiency without consequence. That was how he interpreted it. What he did not see was the accumulation of small uncertainties, each one insignificant on its own. Together, they formed a pattern that did not align with the certainty he was presenting. The system was still producing results, but it was no longer maintaining coherence. By the time the funding meeting was less than 24 hours away, the system still looked stable from the outside. The dashboards continued to display clean curves. Growth projections remained aligned with the narrative Ryan Blake had prepared. There were no visible disruptions, no alerts, no system-level failures. That stability reinforced the assumption that everything was under control. Ryan spent most of that day rehearsing. He adjusted phrasing, refined transitions between slides, and synchronized the visual data with the story he intended to present. Every number supported a specific point. Every chart had a purpose. He was not preparing to explain the system. He was preparing to present certainty. Daniel Brooks reviewed the final deck in the afternoon. He focused on the projections, the consistency between reported metrics, and the overall trajectory. He did not question the underlying data. He asked one question. Are these numbers defensible? Ryan answered without hesitation. Yes. That answer depended on a definition of defensibility that assumed consistency was enough. It was not. Internally, the pattern of discrepancies had expanded. Not dramatically, but consistently. Small misalignments between data sources were no longer isolated. They began to overlap. Timing differences introduced subtle distortions in aggregated metrics. Nothing broke, but the relationships between numbers became less precise. Reports that should have matched began to diverge slightly. Forecast models adjusted based on inputs that were no longer fully synchronized. The outputs still appeared reasonable, but the logic behind them was no longer consistent. Maya Chen reviewed a third report late that evening. She compared it with earlier versions, checking for trends rather than isolated errors. The pattern was clear enough to recognize, but not clear enough to define. She paused, considering whether to escalate. There was no threshold for uncertainty, only for failure. She closed the report without sending a message. From her perspective, raising a concern without a clear explanation would not change the decision. Ryan remained focused on alignment. The presentation, the narrative, the confidence in delivery. He did not look at the underlying reports. He trusted the dashboards. Because the dashboards had not failed him before. That was the foundation of his confidence. What he did not account for was the difference between a system that produces consistent output and a system that produces reliable meaning. The numbers were still consistent, but they were no longer reliable. The morning of the funding meeting began earlier than usual. The office was quieter, but not calm. People arrived ahead of schedule, moving with a sense of precision that did not leave room for hesitation. Every detail had been prepared in advance. Every scenario had been rehearsed. From the outside, it looked controlled. Ryan Blake reviewed the final version of the dashboard before the meeting. The numbers had updated overnight, as expected. Growth metrics remained within projected ranges. Engagement data aligned with the narrative he had built. Nothing appeared out of place. That confirmation was enough for him. He did not question how the numbers had been generated. He did not need to. The system had always delivered consistency, and consistency had become his definition of reliability. Daniel Brooks arrived shortly after. He did not engage in extended discussion. He checked the key metrics, compared them against previous projections, and nodded once. "Keep it simple," he said. "No surprises." There was no reason to expect any. Maya Chen stood near the edge of the conference room, reviewing the internal reports one more time. The pattern of discrepancies had not resolved overnight. It had become more consistent, still small, still within acceptable limits, but no longer random. She understood what that implied. Not a failure, but a shift. Something that required interpretation, not just observation. She looked toward the dashboard displayed on the main screen. The numbers there were still aligned, still clean, still presentable. The difference between those two views was not visible unless someone was looking for it. No one was. The meeting began on time. Investors joined remotely, their focus directed entirely at the presentation. They were not evaluating the system. They were evaluating the story the system supported. Ryan moved through the slides with confidence. Each transition was smooth. Each data point reinforced the previous one. Growth trends, retention curves, forward projections, everything connected. Until the first question, it was not confrontational. It was precise. How do you reconcile this growth projection with the engagement data from the last update? Ryan paused for a fraction of a second, not long enough to appear uncertain, but long enough to register the difference. The numbers on the slide were consistent. The question referred to a relationship between them, a relationship that no longer aligned perfectly. He answered based on the output, because that was all he had. Ryan Blake answered the question without hesitation. He referenced the projection model, explained the expected lag between engagement signals and revenue impact, and pointed back to the overall growth trajectory. The explanation was structured. It followed the narrative he had prepared. On the surface, it worked. The investors did not interrupt. They listened, then moved to the next slide. But the pattern had shifted. The second question came from a different voice. "Can you walk us through how these inputs are weighted in your forecast?" It was not a challenge. It was a request for clarity. Ryan glanced briefly at the dashboard, then back to the slide. The weights were embedded in the system, not visible in the presentation, not part of the narrative. He described the logic in general terms. Historical performance, trend alignment, standard modeling assumptions. The explanation was accurate at a high level. It was not precise, because precision required context, and context was no longer available. Maya Chen watched the exchange without speaking. She could see the difference between the answers and the questions. The answers described output. The questions were probing relationships. That gap had not existed before. Another investor leaned forward. "These two metrics were aligned in your previous report. They are not aligned now." "What changed?" Ryan paused again, slightly longer this time. He looked at the numbers. They were both correct. They had been generated by the same system, but they no longer described the same state. He adjusted his explanation. Introduced the idea of recent variability. External factors. Short-term fluctuations that would normalize over time. It was a reasonable answer. It was not verifiable, because the system no longer tracked those distinctions explicitly. Daniel Brooks remained still, his attention fixed on the exchange. He did not intervene. He did not redirect. He waited. He understood the importance of perception. Confidence did not require perfection. It required control. Ryan continued through the presentation, but the rhythm had changed. Each slide required more explanation. Each data point invited more questions. Not because the numbers were wrong, but because they were no longer self-explanatory. The system was still producing output, but the output no longer carried its own meaning. The questions did not stop. They became more specific. Not aggressive, not confrontational, but increasingly precise. Each one focused on a relationship between numbers, rather than the numbers themselves. Each one required a level of explanation that the system no longer supported. Ryan Blake continued to answer. His tone remained steady. His delivery did not change. From the outside, he still appeared in control, but the structure of his responses began to shift. He moved away from direct explanations and toward broader interpretations. Market dynamics, seasonal variation, user behavior trends, concepts that could justify movement without requiring exact alignment. The investors listened, but they did not move forward as quickly as before. They paused between slides. They compared values. They asked follow-up questions that connected data points across different sections of the presentation. The system had been designed to present each metric clearly. It had not been designed to explain how those metrics interacted under changing conditions without intervention. That layer had never been automated. It had been maintained. Maya Chen observed the pattern in silence. She did not need to see the underlying code to understand what was happening. The consistency of the output was still there, but the coherence was not. The numbers no longer formed a complete picture. They formed fragments that required interpretation, and interpretation required context. Daniel Brooks shifted slightly in his chair. It was a small movement, but noticeable. His attention had moved from the presentation to the reaction of the investors. He was not evaluating the data, he was evaluating confidence. Confidence was no longer stable. One of the investors asked a final question before the discussion moved toward closing. If we look at these projections over the next 2 quarters, what assumptions are you making about data consistency? The question was simple. The answer was not. Ryan paused again. Long enough this time for the room to register it, because the assumption had always been the same. That the system would continue to produce consistent output. What he could not explain was how that consistency was being maintained, because it was no longer being maintained at all. Ryan Blake answered the question in the only way he could. He described the system as stable. He pointed to historical consistency. He emphasized the reliability of the pipeline and the maturity of the data infrastructure. Everything he said was technically correct. It was no longer complete. The investors did not challenge him directly. They acknowledged the explanation, then shifted the conversation toward timing, structure, and next steps. The meeting moved forward, but the pace had changed. The momentum was no longer automatic. It required effort. Daniel Brooks closed the presentation with a concise summary. He reinforced the key points, restated the growth narrative, and thanked the investors for their time. His tone was controlled, measured, consistent with the position he held. From the outside, the meeting ended without disruption. No rejection, no immediate concern, but the outcome had already shifted. Confidence had not been established. It had been questioned. After the call ended, the room remained quiet for a few seconds longer than usual. Not long enough to be acknowledged, but long enough to be felt. Ryan turned back to the dashboard. The numbers were still there, still aligned, still presenting the same story. But the questions had changed how those numbers were perceived. He opened one of the internal reports. The same report Maya Chen had reviewed earlier. The discrepancies were still present. Slight differences between data sources that should have matched. He scrolled through the entries, looking for a clear cause. There was none, no error message, no failure flag, no indication of what needed to be fixed, only variation. Variation without explanation. Maya stepped closer to the table, her attention on the same report. "It was not like this last week," she said quietly. Ryan did not respond immediately. He compared timestamps, checked for delays, reviewed the processing logs. Everything appeared normal. The system had executed every step as expected. Execution was not the problem. Interpretation was. Daniel Brooks did not look at the report. He watched Ryan instead. "How long has this been happening?" he asked. Ryan hesitated, because there was no clear starting point. The system had not failed. It had drifted, and drift does not announce itself. Ryan Blake kept scrolling through the report, searching for a point where the system had failed. There was no failure. Every process had completed. Every job had run on schedule. Data had been collected, transformed, and delivered exactly as configured. From a technical standpoint, nothing was broken. That made the problem harder to define, because systems that fail can be repaired. Systems that drift require understanding. He opened another report, then another. Each one showed the same pattern: small variations, minor inconsistencies, relationships between metrics that no longer aligned perfectly. Individually, each difference was acceptable. Together, they formed something else, a structure that no longer held. Maya Chen remained quiet, but her focus did not shift. She was not looking for errors. She was looking for changes in behavior, patterns that suggested the system was no longer operating under the same assumptions. "What changed last week?" she asked. Ryan did not answer immediately. He reviewed the deployment logs. Minor updates, routine patches. Nothing significant. No major releases. No architectural changes. The system had not been altered, which meant the difference came from somewhere else. Daniel Brooks stepped closer, his attention moving from Ryan to the data itself. He did not analyze the numbers in detail. He looked at their structure, how they related to each other. "They do not line up," he said. It was not an accusation, it was an observation. Ryan leaned back slightly, considering the implication. The numbers were still valid. They had been generated by the same system, using the same inputs. But they no longer described a single, coherent state. They described fragments. Fragments that required interpretation to connect. "That is variance," Ryan said. "Short-term variability." Maya shook her head slightly. "Variance does not repeat like this," she said. She pointed to the timestamps. The discrepancies followed a pattern. Not random, not isolated. Consistent in their inconsistency. That distinction mattered. Random variation can be ignored. Patterned variation cannot. Ryan closed the report and opened the main dashboard again. The charts still looked stable. The curves still aligned with expectations. But now he was looking at them differently. Not as output, as a representation of something he could no longer fully explain. Daniel watched him for a moment longer. "Can you fix it?" he asked. Ryan did not answer, because fixing something requires knowing what it is. And at that moment, the system was still functioning. It was just no longer understood. Ryan Blake did not respond to Daniel Brooks right away. He turned back to the dashboard again, as if the answer might be visible there. The charts had not changed. The curves still moved the way they were expected to move. If someone looked at them without context, they would not see a problem. That was the issue. The problem did not exist at the surface. It existed underneath, where relationships between data points were no longer consistent. Ryan opened the system configuration files. He searched for thresholds, rules, anything that might explain the pattern. Everything was static. Fixed logic, defined behavior. The system was executing exactly as designed. But it had never been fully defined. That was the part he had overlooked. Maya Chen moved to the other side of the table, reviewing a separate set of reports. She was not trying to fix anything. She was trying to understand the boundary of the issue, where it began, how far it extended. "It is spreading," she said. Ryan looked up. "What do you mean?" "It is not just one data stream anymore," she said. "It is affecting multiple outputs." That changed the scope. A single discrepancy could be isolated. Multiple discrepancies suggested a common cause. Ryan began checking the integration points, external APIs, internal data sources, latency between systems. Everything appeared normal. No delays beyond expected ranges. No failed requests. From a technical perspective, the system was healthy. But the results were not aligning. Daniel Brooks remained focused on the outcome. He did not engage with the details. "Do we have a timeline?" he asked. Ryan hesitated again. Because there was no clear point where the system had shifted. No deployment, no update, no event that marked the beginning. The drift had started quietly, without a signal, without a cause that could be traced. Maya closed one of the reports and looked directly at Ryan, who was maintaining the adjustments. She asked. The question was direct, not about the system, about the process behind it. Ryan did not answer immediately, because the answer required acknowledging something he had already decided was unnecessary. The system had been stable for weeks. That stability had not been automatic. It had been maintained. and that layer was no longer present. The room remained quiet for a moment, long enough for the implication to settle, not as a conclusion, but as a possibility they had not considered. Ryan Blake understood the question before he answered it, not in terms of data, but in terms of responsibility. He shifted his focus away from the reports and back to the system itself. The architecture had not changed. The inputs were still flowing. The outputs were still being generated. But the layer that connected them had never been fully defined. It had been managed, quietly, continuously, without being visible. That was handled internally, he said. The statement was technically correct. It was not specific. Maya Chen did not look away. By who? She asked. Ryan paused. The answer required more than a name. It required acknowledging that the system had depended on something that was not documented, not automated, and not accounted for in the decision that removed it. He did not say it immediately. Instead, he returned to the data, searching for a way to explain the pattern without addressing the source. He compared historical outputs, reviewed prior reports, checked for any indication that the system had behaved this way before. It had not. That was the difference. The system was producing results, but those results no longer aligned with their own history. Consistency had been replaced by approximation. Daniel Brooks stepped closer to the table, his attention fixed on the interaction between Ryan and the data. "Can we stabilize it?" he asked. The question was direct, not about cause, about outcome. Ryan considered the system again. The logic was still there. The rules were still applied. But the decisions that had once guided those rules were no longer being made. He could see the structure. He could not see the intent behind it. Not immediately, he said. It was the first time he had acknowledged a limitation. Maya Chen closed another report and set it aside. This was not automatic, she said. It was being adjusted. Her tone remained neutral, not accusatory, observational. But the implication was clear. The system had not been self-sustaining. It had appeared that way because someone had been sustaining it. Ryan did not respond. Because the conclusion did not require confirmation. It was already present in the data. The discrepancies were not errors. They were the absence of correction. And absence does not leave a trace. It only leaves a gap. The room did not shift into urgency. There was no immediate escalation, no raised voices, no visible panic. The system was still running, and as long as it continued to produce output, the situation remained ambiguous. That ambiguity delayed action. Ryan Blake continued reviewing the reports, moving from one dataset to another, trying to isolate a point of correction. He adjusted filters, reran queries, compared outputs across different time windows. Each adjustment produced a result. None of them restored alignment. The more he interacted with the system, the clearer the pattern became. The discrepancies were not caused by a single variable. They were distributed across multiple layers. Input timing, data normalization, aggregation logic, each one slightly off, individually acceptable, collectively unstable. Maya Chen remained focused on observation rather than intervention. She mapped the inconsistencies across reports, tracing where they overlapped and where they diverged. "It is not one issue," she said. "It is a loss of consistency across layers." Ryan did not respond immediately because that description matched what he was seeing. The system was no longer operating as a single structure. It was operating as separate components that no longer agreed with each other. Daniel Brooks shifted his attention from the data back to Ryan. "What does this mean for the next review?" he asked. The question was practical. The next investor follow-up was scheduled within 48 hours. There was no time for a full rebuild. Ryan considered the options. He could attempt to manually align the outputs, adjust the numbers to match expected relationships. But that required understanding the underlying logic that had originally maintained that alignment. That logic was not documented. It had never been formalized. Maya looked at him again. "You are trying to correct the output," she said. "But the issue is before that." Ryan stopped scrolling, because she was right. The outputs were not the source of the problem. They were the result of a system that no longer applied the same decisions it once did. And without those decisions, correction at the output level would only create new inconsistencies elsewhere. Daniel remained silent for a moment. Then he asked a different question. Who understood this system at that level? This time, the question was not about data. It was about knowledge. Ryan looked at the screen, then away from it, because the answer was already clear, and it had already been removed. Ryan Blake did not answer the question right away. He looked at the system again, not as a set of outputs, but as a structure he had assumed was complete. The dashboards were still active. The numbers were still updating. Everything appeared intact, but the coherence was gone. That was the difference. Daniel Brooks waited, not impatient, but focused. He did not need a detailed explanation. He needed to understand whether the problem had a solution within the current team. Maya Chen did not move. She already understood the direction of the answer. Ryan finally spoke. He built most of it, he said. The statement was simple. It carried more weight than he intended. Daniel did not ask who. He already knew. The name had been removed from the system at the same time as the role. "Can we bring him back?" Daniel asked. Ryan did not respond immediately, because that question required more than a technical answer. It required acknowledging that the decision to remove him had created a dependency they had not accounted for. Maya looked at Ryan, then at Daniel. He was not just maintaining it, she said. He was interpreting it. That distinction changed the problem. Maintenance can be reassigned. Interpretation cannot be transferred without context. Ryan opened the system logs again, as if they might provide a different answer this time. They did not. Every process had executed as expected. The system had done exactly what it was designed to do. The issue was that it was no longer being guided. Daniel stepped back slightly, considering the implications. The next investor follow-up would not be based on the presentation. It would be based on confidence, and confidence had already shifted. "If we cannot explain the numbers, we cannot defend them," he said. It was not a conclusion. It was a condition. Ryan nodded once, because that was the part that could not be corrected quickly. The system could be adjusted. The outputs could be modified. But without a consistent logic behind those adjustments, every correction would introduce a new inconsistency somewhere else. Maya closed the final report. "This is not going to stabilize on its own," she said. No one disagreed. The system was still running, but it was no longer trusted. The follow-up did not happen the way they expected. There was no immediate rejection, no direct statement that the deal was off. Instead, there was delay. Investors requested additional clarification, more detailed breakdowns, independent validation of key metrics, requests that would have been simple to answer a week earlier. Now they required explanation the system could not provide. Ryan Blake tried to reconstruct the logic. He worked through the data manually, aligning reports, adjusting inputs, attempting to recreate the consistency that had once been automatic. Each adjustment produced a temporary result. None of them held, because the system was no longer guided by the same decisions that had shaped it before. Daniel Brooks watched the process without intervening. He did not question the effort. He understood the limitation. Speed had been replaced by uncertainty. And in that environment, timing mattered more than correction. Maya Chen documented the changes, not to fix them, but to track how the system behaved without its previous layer of interpretation. The pattern remained consistent. Outputs continued. Alignment did not. The investors did not withdraw immediately. They waited, and waiting changed the dynamic. Momentum slowed. Confidence shifted. The narrative that had once been clear required explanation, and explanation introduced doubt. By the time a second review was scheduled, the conditions were different. The numbers had been adjusted, but not stabilized. The explanations had been refined, but not simplified. The system was still operational, but it was no longer trusted. That was enough. The funding did not collapse in a single moment. It moved away, gradually, without a definitive break. A delay became hesitation. Hesitation became reconsideration. and reconsideration removed urgency. Without urgency, the opportunity lost its shape. Ryan stood in the same conference room days later, looking at the dashboard again. The numbers were still there, still updating, still presenting a version of the story he had tried to tell. But now they required interpretation he could not provide. Daniel had already shifted focus to alternative strategies. Different timelines, new assumptions. Maya closed her final report and left it on the table. No one said it directly. There was no single point where the system failed. It had not broken, it had drifted. And in that drift, something essential had been removed. Not the data, not the structure, the meaning behind it. Ethan Cole had not taken anything with him. He had not changed the system. He had only stopped maintaining the layer that made it coherent. And without that layer, the system did exactly what it was designed to do. It produced output, just not understanding.